Hello. They say you are what you eat. Biologically speaking, you're made up of the landscape that feeds you. My blood and bone and muscle have been composed of this spot, this priceless piece of native prairie. My background is in biology, and my passion is the welfare of the earth and its creatures. I'd like to invite you to retrace with me some of my steps in a path of discovery that I've been on over the last few years, living on and with the land as a rancher, and teaching an on-again, off-again long-distance college course about the place of humans in the ecosystem. According to the Wilderness Act of 1964, a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that inspiring and poetic and grand? I did my PhD work studying a cosmopolitan grass, Kentucky bluegrass. I studied the sequences of some of its non-coding chloroplast DNA, trying to gain some insight into its travels across the globe. Kentucky bluegrass is one of about 4 species of grass that has managed to establish in Antarctica, which means, although it doesn't care for the tropics, if you go to any continent on planet Earth, you will find Kentucky bluegrass, alive and well. Now there is a species which is more cosmopolitan even than Kentucky bluegrass, that does not even mind those tropics, and it's a species that I know you're all very familiar with, if for no other reason than that it's standing here talking to you right this second. Now if we allow both of those ideas into our heads at the same time, that a wilderness is a place untrammeled by man, where man himself is but a visitor who does not remain, and that human beings are a cosmopolitan species that for millennia have been found in every corner of the globe, a very disturbing picture can arise if we let it. And we can find ourselves asking, is it possible that a wilderness is something that is created by human beings? And that human beings create it by first declaring that the people living in that place are either not really people or not really living there, and removing them. This idea was first brought home to me by a brilliant article in The Guardian by George Monbiot. And because this article had such an impact on my thinking, I would like to share with you some excerpts. The construction of wilderness has always been a key component of the colonial project. Almost everywhere that European settlers went, they either proclaimed the land they seized to be terra nullius, or by expelling its people ensured that it became so. The Normans, for example, were obsessed by hunting, and many of them joined the invasion of 1066 simply to secure new reserves. William I established several forests. At that time, the word meant royal hunting estates, whose inhabitants he cleared. The great wildernesses of Scotland were established for the same purpose and by the same means 700 years later. But these reserves were tiny by comparison to the wildernesses the British colonists made in East Africa. After the Second World War, Bernhard Grzimek, the, quote, father of conservation, unquote, in East Africa, announced that he would turn the Serengeti in northern Tanzania into a vast national park. This land, which is possibly the longest inhabited place on Earth, was, he declared, a, quote, primordial wilderness, unquote. Though there was no evidence that local people threatened the wildlife, Grzimek decided that, quote, no men, not even native ones, should live inside its borders, unquote. Only the whites could afford the entrance fees to the reserves, so only they were permitted to enter the new primordial wilderness. This project was, from the beginning, assisted by Wildlife Films. Grzimek's documentary, Serengeti Shall Not Die, generated massive enthusiasm for his ethnic cleansing program. Joy Adamson drove the eastern Samburu out of their best grazing lands. She described the Samburu as squatters. Television shows, by presenting the natural world as something apart from humanity, create the impression that conservation means exclusion. Glacier Park was originally part of the reservation which was promised to the Blackfeet people. But someone thought that he had discovered gold there, and as a result, the Blackfeet were strongly encouraged to want to sell their land to the federal government. Chief Whitecalf of the Pagan expressed his joy over the upcoming sale with the following words: "Chief Mountain is my head. Now my head is cut off. The mountains have been my last refuge." In time it became clear that there was no gold in Glacier. And because it was a wilderness, because no one lived there and no one wanted it, it became a national park. A very beautiful national park. It has always been my very favorite. But I must admit that learning that it is Chief Whitecalf's severed head has tempered my enjoyment with sorrow. The fall 2011 issue of American Archaeology includes an article about Central Park, the wilderness in the midst of New York City. Here are some excerpts. Seneca Village was the first significant community of African American property owners in New York City. About 300 people, predominantly middle-class blacks, lived there from 1825 to 1857. The village included houses laid out on the city grid, 3 churches, a school, and several cemeteries. The city raised everything in 1857 after it seized the property for the park. News accounts during the eviction period, when about 1,600 people throughout Manhattan were displaced, erroneously portrayed Seneca Village as a shanty town. Their stuff is still there. My parents traveled to Yellowstone National Park, and while there they met the nephew of a man whose homestead, the land that his government had promised would belong to him and his heirs and assigns forever, was near Yellowstone Park. The story they brought home was this. The park began looking to expand, and the uncle became fearful, so he traveled to Washington, D.C. to beg his elected representatives for assurances that he would not be forced to leave his home against his will. His elected representatives assured him that the property was his own and that he had nothing to fear from his Park Service. When he returned home, he discovered that his house and buildings and all he had mysteriously burned to the ground, and his chickens were roosting in the trees. Today, that family's ranch is part of Yellowstone Park. So we've seen a number of examples from different time periods and different continents where indeed a wilderness has been created by human beings, and created by declaring that the people existing there were not really people, or not really living there, and removing them. Now we need to ask ourselves, does it matter? Yes, this is a human tragedy. But human history is full of human tragedies. In fact, the more cynical among us might say that all of humanity is about those with more power stomping on those with less power. And it should be our goal as human beings to amass sufficient power that we're the ones doing the stomping instead of those being stomped. So we ask, from the point of view of the planet, does it make a difference? To address that question, I would like to bring up the word keystone species. An ecosystem, like this one, is a complex tapestry of many species, not just animals and plants and birds, but fungus, bacteria, euglena, all interacting with each other and with the landscape to create a functioning whole. Now, some of those species, although every species in an ecosystem is important, seem to be somewhat replaceable. This is a Maximilian sunflower. It's very beautiful. It's a perennial native, and it grows along these watercourses. But when it is not present, there are other perennial natives along these watercourses. It's very important to some of the insects. But we can ask, if the Maximilian sunflowers were to suddenly disappear or suddenly appear somewhere, would that ecosystem be able to adjust, to survive, to continue very much like it had up until the change? Now, there are other species called keystone species which have an outsized impact on the landscape or on the other species with which they share the ecosystem. For example, right up that way, there's a family of beaver living. And beaver are often called, because of the outsized impact on the landscape of the ecosystems they inhabit, a keystone species. In fact, the keystone species theory says that, as with classical architecture, if you take a keystone species and you remove it from the ecosystem, you will cause that entire ecosystem to collapse and to cease to exist. It does not collapse into a black hole, nor into a vacuum. This is biology. At the very second of collapse, at the instant this happens, something new, but different, begins to develop in place of what was there before. But with nearly 14 years of college biology behind me, I can say fairly confidently that as human beings, we don't begin to have the faintest notion what will come to being on a landscape where we have removed the keystone species and caused the existing ecosystem to collapse. There will be something there. Perhaps not something as stable, perhaps not something as diverse, perhaps not something as complex, and perhaps not something that supports those same species as originally made that place home. Now, given what you know about human beings, do you consider them more like the Maximilian sunflowers or more like the beaver? Do you think that human beings have much impact on the landscapes they inhabit? Do you think they affect the other species that share a landscape with them? What do you think are the chances that human beings are a keystone species? And if they are, if we declare that we want a wilderness and that we will say that the people living there are not really people or not really living there and remove them, will we cause the collapse of that ecosystem? This idea was brought home to me most strongly by the journals of Lewis and Clark. I've always been confused by the journals of Lewis and Clark, because in this place that makes me, that I am, that I know well, what everyone notices about the journals of Lewis and Clark are the immense herds of wild game that they saw. And this is interpreted as evidence of how diverse and productive this area was before it was messed up by the European colonists. I never questioned that interpretation. And yet, as a botanist, as someone very familiar with the area, I was very confused. I didn't understand, if the area was so healthy and productive, why, whenever Lewis and Clark described watersheds or soils or vegetation, they described an area where the ecosystem was damaged, where the processes were out of balance, an area that was collapsing. I couldn't help but wonder, why did Lewis and Clark describe an area that I know to host a rich diversity of native grasses and forbs, not to mention some shrubs and trees, as soil producing but little vegetation of any kind except the prickly pear, but little grass, and that very low? Why was the Big Dry Creek dry on the 9th of May? In almost 70 years of USGS data, over the course of some terrible droughts, Big Dry Creek, not to mention its much smaller tributary Nelson Creek, have never, ever, not once, not any year, been dry on the 9th of May. What was wrong? And then one day, I was leafing through my copy of Holistic Management, and I came upon this picture, which I've seen many times before, but which had never before affected me like a lightning strike. On page 21 and 22, we have photos 3.2 and 3.3. Two pictures about 30 years apart, taken of the Zambezi River. The earlier picture, pretty and well vegetated. The second, as I suddenly realized, an illustration of what was being described by Lewis and Clark. The banks are falling in very fast. I sometimes wonder that some of our canoes or pirogues are not swallowed up by means of these immense masses of earth, which are eternally precipitating themselves into the river. We have had many hairbreadth escapes from them. And I realized that this picture showed exactly what I was reading in Lewis and Clark. Now, according to Alan Savory, who took these pictures and was there at the time, along the Zambezi River there were a group of people who had been living there for a very long time, and those people had been hunting and trapping and drumming and growing gardens and having homes and doing all those things that people normally do when they live in an area for a long period of time. And the behavior of those people along the Zambezi affected the behavior of the elephants who also lived along the Zambezi. And the behavior of the elephants affected the vegetation along the river, such that the vegetation was able to support large herds of elephants and other wildlife, which was ultimately very unfortunate for the people living there because their governments decided that it was time to have a wilderness. As we've learned, the people were removed. The important point here is that it does not mean that there were no people along the Zambezi. There were still Homo sapiens there. But Homo sapiens had changed their behavior. No longer were they hunting, trapping, gardening, playing drums. Now, they were riding in jeeps, taking pictures, doing scientific studies. And the change in the behavior of the people changed the behavior of the elephants, and the change in the behavior of the elephants changed the vegetation. According to Savory, with nothing but the change in behavior of one species, these areas became terribly impoverished and are still deteriorating seriously as I write. Now, the reason that this picture that illustrated what I was seeing in the Lewis and Clark journals and what was confusing me so much impacted me like a blow to the head was because that picture was taken about 30 years after the picture of the healthy vegetation. And I suddenly remembered what I had just read and almost not noticed as important, that 25 years, the exact same time frame, before Lewis and Clark had traveled through this area, the area had accidentally become a wilderness. You see, in this area, for thousands of years, the Pekuni had a very impressive bison empire. They had managed tremendous numbers of bison and exported their harvest as far south as Mexico and even beyond. And unfortunately, in 1780, 25 years before Lewis and Clark, one of those trading expeditions had come back, not just with pretty trade goods and all the useful things that you need on the prairies, but with smallpox, introduced into Central and South America by the Spanish. The people died. Even though the tribe remained, they were decimated to the extent that their behavior changed. And when their behavior changed, the behavior of the large herds that they managed changed. And when the behavior of the large herds changed, the vegetation changed. And so, Lewis and Clark saw tremendous herds of large game animals, but a deteriorating and damaged watersheds, soils, and vegetation. Now, for just a minute, I'd like to ask you to think about what caused the bison to go nearly extinct. We've all learned this in school. We all know this. It was overhunting by the whites, wasn't it? All right. How many bison were there? A quick glance at the internet will show you that 60 million is what you'll see most often. All right. So let's say that half of those were cows. That's 30 million. A healthy bison herd can fairly easily increase by about half the number of cows. That's new healthy calves born minus whatever's going to die of old age and accidents and so on. That is the increase that is built into every prey species to account for predation. But we're going to be very conservative, so we'll say just a quarter. So that's 7.5 million new bison every year. That's how much the herd is going to grow by, all other things being equal. You go from 60 million to 67.5 million the next year. Now, if you look at the old records of the bison kill, with the estimates of what wasn't recorded, what they thought that the tribes had done, what they thought had been destroyed or not mentioned in some way. When the bison slaughter was at its height, the estimated kill was somewhere over 1 million animals. Now, I want you to realize that if you take 1 million hides or 1 million skulls and you pile them up and you climb on top of that pile, you will be boggled, and rightly so. That is a boggling amount of death. 1 million is huge. But even if we say, okay, it was the 1800s, people didn't know how to count, they couldn't estimate, we'll round it up to 2 million. It does not begin to account even for the yearly increase of the herd. Never mind cutting into the base herd. Instead of 60 million after the year that the most bison were slaughtered, there should have been 65 million. And we all know that that didn't happen. Well, it's easy to say that, okay, so there weren't 60 million bison, or something other than the hunters killed them off. But what we need to think about is that damaged vegetation that Lewis and Clark saw. Once you know to start looking for it, the old records are absolutely peppered with oblique references to bison die-offs by disease. Massive, terrible, stunning die-offs, and in some cases to diseases which were native to this continent and had never before, as far as we know, led to the extinction of the bison. And then we ask ourselves, is it possible that when that wilderness was accidentally created, that when the people died of smallpox and changed their behavior, when the keystone human species was removed from that ecosystem, and the behavior of the large animals they had interacted with changed, and the vegetation and the soils and the watersheds changed, could all of that have weakened the herds and left them vulnerable to those tremendous disease outbreaks that ultimately nearly robbed the earth of the American bison? And I ask, do we, as human beings, know what it is that we do when we decide to create a wilderness and we decide that the people who have lived in that ecosystem for 100, 200, or thousands of years are not really a part of that ecosystem, and we remove them? Do we know what it is we do to our beautiful planet? Thank you so very much for listening.